Greetings, friends! Juan Ingrisky here, and this is the weekly Russian-Ukraine War update for the week of November 4th through November 10th of 2024. And this week we are continuously receiving updates from mostly the Pokrovsk and South Donetsk direction, so let's get right into them. Alrighty, so this week, basically, again, like usual, the main focus has been in the South Donetsk direction. Last week I talked about kind of the more broader operational goals of this objective. Again, the main goal here is to collapse this South Donetsk pocket, with the Russians from the north trying to reach Andriivka and the Russians from the south trying to reach Constantinople. And then once this happens, this flattens the front line and this entire pocket is liquidated. And this week, basically, that is what is continuously happening, and the Russians have continuously made slow gains in achieving those goals. Let's talk about the South Donetsk direction in this area first. Now, there's been a bit of a slowdown in these operations, but there's still been a bit of improvements. Let's talk about first in the more western direction. So the Russians are now pushing towards Velika Novoselivka, and I talked about how once this South Donetsk pocket is closed, my guess is that the Russians will continue pushing northwards here, and then do an attack from the west here, and then do an encirclement of Velika Novoselivka. So in this respect, the Russians have been pushing a little bit to the west here. They have captured a few fields to the west of Kharkovsky and Zolta Niva, mostly these fields right here, to create a bit of a buffer zone so that, when the Russian, right now they have Kharkovsky and Zolta Niva and they have a road, and then putting some distance between that road so that they could, reinforce Russian positions here does help them. So they pushed a little bit to the west. They also pushed a little bit to the west from Yasaplnova, took in these fields here. However, some sources are saying that the Russian push towards Rozdonov here, which is what I was expecting, had to be halted a little bit because the Ukrainians were trying to do some counterattacks here. Now they failed, and the Russians have kept on to their gains in Kharkovsky. However, that probably, obviously when you get attacked, you have to kind of halt operations and meet that attack head on. So a little bit movement to the west, a little bit to expand their borders. The Russians are also clearing up and moving a little bit. Now, they haven't really moved north here. Now, some pro-Russian sources are saying the Russians are about reaching here. And so, these fields here, is a big unknown. Pro-Russian sources says these fields have been captured, but we don't have any geolocated footage, and sources like the neutral sources like this Syriac, the map I'm using, and pro-Ukrainian sources have not said that, but it's something to bring up. But what a lot of sources are saying is that the Russians are improving on the more eastern flank here. So the fields that are between Bogdanovka and Maslianovka, so these two villages were taken about a week or two ago, and these fields here were taken by the Russians this week. This makes sense. Just to improve the front line between Bogdanovka and Maslianovka as the Russians push towards Suchka Yal. And then another place where the Russians have improved their positions a little bit is to the to the east of Bogdanovka, taking a few of these tree lines here. So the Russians have improved a little bit, but obviously these are just kind of small tactical gains to improve their positions a little bit. But the South Donetsk direction has definitely slowed down a little bit, but there are still some things to be had. And watch my last video when I talked about like what the whole kind of deal is here. But again, the main goal is to reach Rozolova in the north, Suchka Yar in the east, and then Rozdolovka in the west. And this creates a good. It doesn't make a salient. It actually expands the front line, gives them a lot of buffer room, and then they could do a dash and cut the Zaporozhye Donetsk highway in Constantinople here. That is the main goal there. And then when we talk about more in the more kind of this area near Kurakhove itself, the Russians this week also have made a lot of gains here. The Russians have fully captured the village of Antonovka. This was confirmed by the Ministry of Defense. However, I'm assuming that probably that this northern part of Antonovka has not been captured. We have footage of the Russians raising their flags in the center of Antonovka. Now, the reason why I say this kind of more northern edge, this like western edge of Antonovka has not been taken is because if you zoom down here, there's this giant trench network here that the Ukrainians have built up. And so, this will be very hard. It's a very hard nut to crack. And so, obviously the Russians may take this if they want to continue storming towards Ilyinivka and such. But most of Antonovka has fallen to the Russians. Along with this, a lot of sources are saying the Russians are in the eastern outskirts of Yesenivka here. We have geolocated footage of the Russians being here, so they probably have taken these fields to the south of this little river here that does defend Yasenivka here. But some sources are saying the Russians who have been attacking through these fields here have reached these farms and this area and have captured this area here. But we have no geolocated footage as of yet. So the Russians have cleared Katerninivka and Antonovka basically, and are now reaching Yasenivka and Ilonica. So these are the battles for these two villages have now begun. Along with this, the Russians have made a lot of advances in the fields here between Kurakhove, Maximyanovka, Pobeba, and let's talk about them. So after the capture of Maximyanovka, the Russians have focused southwards here. They have captured all the fields here. All the fields that are here, they captured this week, and that's a lot of good gains. And a lot of sources are saying the Russians are now pushing towards the village of Dolinovka here, this village right here. If they could capture this, they could cut the main road where Kurakhove. Now, one thing I talked about is that the village of Uspenska, after the fall of Bogdanovka, Novoukrayinka, and Charkasky, the main Ukrainian defenses have fallen back to this river that is held with Uspenska as the center. So this is where the Ukrainians are trying to hold up. However, so they could prevent the Russians from reaching Kurakhove. However, if the Russians could reach Dolinovka here and cut to this road here, then this will become like a mini pocket within the South Donetsk pocket, and then all these villages and Uspenska will collapse. And so clearing these fields has been there's a lot of big gains for the Russians, and we shall see. And the main goal of this obviously is to reach this village here and cut this road connecting Kurakhove and Uspenska. But clearing these fields, they've been also pushing north from Pobeba and constantly pushing away from this road. They conquered these fields here this week as well, and they'll probably conquer these fields because now that they captured Antonovka as well. So my guess is that also the Russians pushing north here. Right now the battles are going from Churdrovo here. So if the Russians could reach something like this, right, and then and the Russians have captured Churdrovo, then this entire pocket will probably fall. And what the Russians are probably hoping is to capture. Let me kind of erase all these stuff here, and then probably have something like this. Capture this kind of small pocket here, and then continue pushing. Northwards here. And, the Ukrainians are slowly giving up, just as, this Garnik pocket where the Ukrainians slowly fell back from the fields here. Remember, they were battling for Novolsky and things like that, but they had to slowly give up all these fields because the Russians were, slowly closing the pocket. And since the Russians are very, these operations are slow, they're not, lightning fast like World War II, it will take a lot of, we could say, it gives the Ukrainians a lot of time to retreat, basically. And so, they'll slowly give up these fields, and they'll slowly start pushing towards Kurakhove and start, retreating back here. Drinking some water here. Water's so fucking good. Anyway. Yeah, so that's probably what's happening here. A lot of gains to these fields, in the fields here. Also, the Russians have reached the eastern outskirts of Kurakhove and have established a foothold in the eastern part here. Also, the Russians have captured another stronghold from the Ukrainians, and is this stronghold right here. So this is this was preventing the Russians from attacking directly towards Kurakhove. And so they'll capture this stronghold, and then entering the eastern outskirts of Kurakhove is good. I don't think I think it is definitely possible that the Russians could capture this kind of eastern residential area. Now there is a river, I believe, that splits this in half. I think this is the river. Let me see. Maybe not. But there is the Ukrainians obviously have this factory on the western side, and then the citadel. So it's going to be very hard to take the center or the western part of Kurakhove. And I don't think they're going to attack directly. I think they're going to, like Selidova, they're going to encircle it on many sides and then force them to give up. But I do see a situation where the Russians could probably take at least the eastern part of Kurakhove, because it's a bit, it's just a bunch of residential areas. So that's the south Donetsk direction, and again, it's linked up with the Pokrovsk direction, which we'll talk about in a moment here. Let me just talk about the small gains that are happening in the Zaporozhye direction. Nothing in the Kherson direction after this week, as usual, but in the Zaporozhye direction, the Russians have made some small gains to the north of Nestor-Donatovka here, and have captured a few areas in this area right here. So just small gains here, just putting some distance between Kopany and Nestor-Donatovka, and yeah, probably just some small tactical gains, but just something to keep in mind. And then one thing that I got while I was getting all the information this week is that the Russians have raised their flags in the village of Marnica. Now, this is very new news. Like, when I was preparing this video and getting all the facts for this week, I just, I was scrolling through my sources, and they showed that the Russians were raising their flags in Marnica, so that, so they captured this village. And I have no doubt that the Russians will then try to push towards Ronopol and Novodarivka and continue their push towards cutting this main road, collecting Velika Novosolovka. So my guess is the Russians will do some sort of big attack here soon to try to take something like this, to push the front line a bit more northward. So that's the Zaporozhye and the Zavdonetsk direction. Now let us start in the Pokrovsk direction. Now, in terms of the main Pokrovsk direction, this area right here, there's been no changes, like in Pokrovsk itself. However, again, the Pokrovsk direction, this area right here, is its connection with doing the Kurakhove pocket from the north. And this is actually where the Russians have made some more gains than in the south this week. So this week, the Russians are improving their positions along the Vochka River reservoir. They have completely, last week we talked about how they took Kurakhove and took the mine and are, are clearing this town. And now the Russians are now pushing along this the Vochka River pocket and have captured the village of Stepanivka here and Ilyinovka. And we saw that because the Russians raised their flags here, and we have situations of the Russians being droned, at least in the northern part here. But a lot of pro-Russian sources are saying Ilyinovka has also fallen, which makes sense. So Stepanivka and Ilyinovka have fallen, and now the Ukrainians are basically trying to hold Berestivsky as much as possible, because then this cuts off. I think this kind of this road has already been destroyed, I think, from Russian missile strikes. So I don't think this road is actually like operational. But but the Russians really do want to take Berestivsky and Staroterny so that the entire northern part of Kurakhove is enveloped. But yeah, again, small gains here. The main goal is to take Berestivsky and Staroterny, but again, they have to move across these fields here, and taking Ilyinovka and Stepanivka is a good first step for that. But where the Russians are making the most gains, again, are actually in this western direction here in the field. They've broken through from the rail lines and are now pushing along these fields. And the main gains in this kind of more in the Selidova direction here is that the Russians have fully taken the village of Novodmitrovka and Nova Alexandrivka. So these were villages that the Russians entered last week, but they did not fully capture until this week. And once they captured these two villages, they also captured all the fields that were between them. So they capture all these fields. They have taken Nova Alexandrivka and Nova Dmitrivka, and so they are now pushing the front line away from Sukurnia and this rail line. And now the Russians are pushing across. If the Russians continue, the Russians right now are trying to push to the north here, but also they're probably going to be pushing to the west here to reach Andriivka. So I expect probably that the Russians will continue pushing to the west until they reach this highway. And then they could then attack Andriivka and finish this pocket. After the capture of Novodmitrovka, the Russians are now battling for the village of Zoria, which will probably be taken very, very soon. The Russians will probably take Zoria this week. They have entered it, but they have not captured it as of yet. But I have no doubts that the Russians will probably raise their flag in Zoria this week. So this will help continue pushing westward. But also, as you can see, there's like a bit of a river here that kind of... So the capture of Zornia allows them to link themselves on this river. And one of the last big things they want to take is the village of Sontiska. And this is one of the biggest... breakthroughs of the Russians this week. So the Russians have broken through these fields, have captured these fields here, and have reached the northern part of Sontiska and have captured it. Now, Sontiska is cut in half by a river. You can see it, the Solona River, right here. So a lot of sources are saying the Russians have taken the northern part of Sontoska, but the battle for the southern part is still ongoing. But again, the Russians will probably take Sontoska. And once they do that, once Zoria and Sontoska, which are now being battled for, are taken, the Russians will then have this position. And then from this position, let's kind of look at the bigger scope here. So let's say the Russians, take these two villages. Then the Russians could then move to the south towards Staroterny and create a pocket for the Ukrainians trying to defend Berestivsky. The Ukrainians trying to defend this village, and then trying to hold off the Russians from the north here. It's going to be a very tough time. And so I expect, it's very possible that by the end of November, the Russians will completely capture this entire area here. The northern part of the pocket will be closed. And, the Russians will probably also keep pushing northwards. They'll probably take Pushitsky and then try to do some, try to take these three villages of Solomonovka, Petropavlovka, and Sentonsko here. And, and so basically the northern pocket will be the northern part will be closed by the end of November. So they have a lot of good gains here. And then in the Selidova direction, this is where the Russians are also making a lot of big progress. The Russians are trying to move along this rail line. And I think that one of the biggest goals is to try to flatten the front line here. So try to flatten the front line along something like this. But I think in the intermediate term, the Russians are trying to reach this water reservoir here to make some distance between Selidova and the Ukrainian positions. And in this week, the Russians have made some good gains. So we talked about the captured Nova Alexandrivka, and the Russians will probably try to take Yugurivka and Pushtinivka here, but they have not entered it yet. Where the Russians have made a lot of progress, though, is they have advanced along the rail line, have captured the southern part of Grigorivka and Petrivka here. So there's a river, the Solona River, that slices these villages in two. However, the Russians, because they're advancing along the rail line, have captured the southern part of it, but the northern part is still being contested. But these two villages are basically going to be captured by the Russians very soon, and the Russians will probably, reach this area right here, and then probably capture the rest of these two villages here. The Russians are also moving to the north of Selidova, and have captured more areas to the north here, capturing this area, and they're probably trying to reach this intersection. So, a lot of gains for the Russians in the Selidova direction. The Russians are just trying to slowly push upwards, and but obviously the Russians have deprioritized reaching Pokrovsk and have prioritized try to create the Kurakhove pocket here. So that's the end of the Pokrovsk direction. Now we're going to talk about the Toretsk direction and the Chasiv Yar direction, because both those areas had small little gains, but not much to talk about. In the Toretsk direction, the Russians are still there's still a lot of fierce fighting. We have geolocated, again, we talked about this last week, the Russians are still battling for these, the Russians have some small positions in the eastern part of this micro-district, but it's still being fought over. The Russians are battling for the center of Toretsk for every large building. And, however, this week we have geolocated footage of the Russians actually capturing some mining buildings here. So we have some geolocated footage of the Russians taking some parts of this mine, which will help encircle the main Ukrainian defense of this big mining complex here. We also have some Russian channels saying that the Ukrainian college was taken, the Toretsk Ukrainian mining college. So this area is probably also being taken by the Russians, and so some small gains in the Toretsk direction. The Russians are slowly battling in the center of Toretsk. It's a long, big, bloody battle, but I don't see how so it's very bloody. The small gains don't show how bloody it is, but the Ukrainians are trying to hold on to Toretsk very much. And then in the Chasiv Yar direction, this map is not updated, but we have geolocated footage of the Russians raising their flags in this area right here. And so the Russians have captured this small mining shaft right here in the fields here. So that's a lot of good news. And I'm pretty certain that the Russians have also taken this mining shaft right here. So the Russians have taken something like this. And so they have a very strong southern offensive here, and a lot of sources are coming in saying that the Russians are now entering the village of Stupochki here. Once they capture the village of Stupochki, which is going to be the last thing they need to do before they can start encircling Chasiv Yar from the south here. So the Russians are making a lot of big gains in the southern part, not big gains, but like solid progress in the south of Chasiv Yar, and Chasiv Yar will probably fall very soon. Not fall soon, but this is definitely now the Russians are putting the squeeze on it after pausing for a little bit. Alright, now we're going to talk about the Seversk direction. In the Seversk direction, the main focus has been in the Ivanodarivka-Vimka area. And again, we talked about this last week, but the Russians need to capture the fortifications on the hillside that are here. if the so right now we have geolocated footage of the Russians being in Vimka and Novarodinivka again, but they cannot hold onto the positions for long unless they capture the fields to the north here above this river. So they have to capture these hills. They have captured some parts of the hills in this area right here, but they have to there's like a big fortification that's right here. Let me see if we could see it on the map here. Yes, here it is. This fortification right here. The Russians need to take this fortification, which is on a hill, in order to secure their gains in Ivano-Dyrivka and Vimka here. I think this is a... Yeah, there's like a trench here and shit. But yeah, so that's the main thing. The Russians are... The Russians are in Ivano-Dyrivka and Vimka. The main goal here is to... But they have to take the hills here, so the main goal is to secure the hills and secure these 3 villages, which will allow them to start reaching the southern part of Seversk. And then we also have some geolocated footage that the Ukrainians are fully in Shirobranka, and that the Russians were bombing this area. So there's like a big gray zone here, so we don't know exactly like who controls what and shit. So this northern part of Seversk is a big unknown. There's actually been no changes in the Le Mans direction. The battle for Terni is still ongoing, but no big changes this week. In the Kupiansk direction, we have some small changes, but not as big as we are used to. In this area, the Russians have improved their positions to the north of Vishana, have captured these fields here, so they're pushing away from the Shtimaktivka Andriivka line. They're slowly reaching Lozova last week. They are now pushing towards Zelinsky Hall here. Right now, the Russians are trying to battle for Kopany. So some small gains in the fields here, and the main goal here is to capture Lozova, Zelensky Hall, and Kopany, and just continue pushing towards the village of Borova, or the town of Borova, which is one of the main goals of the Russians in this axis here. And then, obviously, when the Russians have split the Oskal front in half, the Russians also have captured the most part of Klosanivka here. I think we talked about this last week, but just to make... This is the Russians right now trying to capture the rest of this area so that they could outflank this forest and then take it. So this is a lot of the battles are going on for this forest so that they could completely secure Klosanivka here. So yeah, the Russians making small gains, but nothing big. Yeah, that's the Kupiansk-Le Mans front. In the Kharkov direction, there's been some small gains, actually, for the Ukrainians, or just maybe some clarifications on the front line. In the Volchansk area, the Ukrainians have completely are also in control of the aggregate plant again. This goes back and forth. Sometimes the Russians are in control, sometimes the Ukrainians are, but it's a back and forth, and yeah. But now it looks like the Ukrainians are back in control of the aggregate plant. There are battles for Staritsia here, so the Russians and the Ukrainians are back and forth trying to capture Staritsia. And then in the Globokha area, we have geolocated footage of that the Ukrainians are still in full control of the Lipsy dachas here. So the Ukrainians are still in control of a lot of the Lipsy Volchansk area, and it's, again, I talked about how those are the main, the Russians, have Volchansk and Lipsy as, or the Ukrainians have this as their main defense, and so the Russians took a bit of land, but they didn't take much besides that. So we shall see. So the Ukrainians are holding on to in Kharkov, and are and the collapse of the Kharkov front for the Ukrainians aren't going to happen anytime soon. In the Kursk direction, a lot of sources are saying the Russians are doing the preparations for the third Kursk counteroffensive, and it looks like the Ukrainians are also counterattacking. So the main focus has been in the north here. A lot of sources are saying the Russians have taken the villages of Podovka, Orlovka, and Markivka here. So a lot of sources are saying the Russians did a mad dash here and reached Nikolaevka here. So obviously one of the main goals of the Russian offensive is to try to reach Melaninovka and then kind of cut this entire northern pocket in half, into a circle, and then flatten the front line here. That's probably one of the main goals of the Russian first Kursk offensive here is, because once they could do that, they could then move southwards and start trying to cut the Suchka direction. So, but yeah, so they've been moving. They captured 3 villages, but again, the main goal here is to liquidate this front here. And also a lot of battles are going on for the village of Derino here. So a lot of sources are saying the Russians are battling for this village, but the thing is, it's sliced in half by this river, so the Ukrainians have a good position in holding on here. And yeah, also the Trump has won the presidential elections in the United States. That's good, but again, the big thing about that is that this could affect about the negotiations for Ukraine, and I don't think the negotiations are actually going to go anywhere. There's a lot of unknown factors. Anything could go, but I think there's still irreconcilable positions. Like even if you try to like compromise, each side has like core demands that they want that I think can't be negotiated out of, and like Russia's obviously gaining on the ground, so I don't think they'll be in a position to like just freeze the conflict. I think the Russians at least want their 4 oblasts. So that's the end of this video. Hope you guys enjoyed. Be sure to like this video if you liked this video. Well, I guess yeah, obviously. But be sure to like this video, comment your thoughts. Be sure to subscribe to my channel if you want to continue seeing these weekly Russian-Ukraine war updates. And I hope you have a wonderful day. So aim high and wander on.